It was a clear night over western Siberia on March 23, 1994, when Aeroflot Flight 593 took off from Moscow's Sheremetyevo International Airport. The Airbus A310, registration FOGQS, was flying a scheduled domestic passenger service to Hong Kong with mostly business travelers on board. The experienced pilot, Captain Alexander Kluyev, was joined by co-pilot Andrei Laponin and flight engineer Sergei Lyubinsky in the cockpit. There were 75 passengers, along with 12 crew members, for a total of 87 souls on board. After taking off and reaching its initial cruising altitude of 33,000 feet, Flight 593 settled in for the long flight across Russia to its first stop in Khabarovsk. In the cabin, flight attendants prepared meal services while passengers read or tried to sleep. In the cockpit, the pilots monitored the various systems and instruments to ensure everything was operating normally. About 2 hours into the flight, Capt. Kluyev decided to take a short break, leaving co-pilot Laponin in charge temporarily. It was then that Laponin made the fateful decision to allow his 15-year-old son, Eldar, to visit the cockpit. Though it was against regulations to have unauthorized persons on the flight deck, Laponin likely felt comfortable with his son joining him briefly. After all, Eldar had expressed an interest in becoming a pilot himself one day. With the autopilot controlling the plane, Laponin began to explain some of the instruments and let his son sit at the controls. At some point, either Laponin or Eldar accidentally disengaged the autopilot without the pilots realizing it. Subtle changes in the flight controls went unnoticed as Eldar gripped the yoke, likely thinking he was just playing around rather than actually controlling the huge jetliner. A slow turn began as Eldar turned the yoke slightly to the left, dipping the plane's wing without anyone noticing the deviation. Alarms should have sounded to alert the crew, but it is believed a pin had been inserted to mute the speaker during Capt. Kluyev's break. By the time Capt. Kluyev returned to the cockpit, Flight 593 had descended about half a mile and was in the midst of a bank turn to the left. He immediately realized their situation and began attempting to level the plane, but the angle was too severe. Though they were still 34,000 feet in the air, the aircraft began a roller coaster phugoid motion, sloshing up and down precariously through over 5,000 feet of altitude change. In the cabin, flight attendants struggled to push carts into galleys and take passenger service items as the aircraft heaved violently. Passengers who had not been wearing seatbelts were tossed about, colliding with luggage, seats, and even other passengers. All through the cabin came screams of terror as the aircraft plunged up and down with intense G-forces. In the cockpit, the flight crew desperately tried to regain control and level their wings. The violent maneuvers had caused their speed to decrease significantly, and the stall warning sounded as they approached dangerously low speeds. Alternating between left and right banks, the pilots could not get the wings stabilized before the aircraft finally stalled completely and began to spiral toward the ground. At 33,500 feet, the tail section separated from the fuselage as it twisted out of shape from aerodynamic forces. Now, in an uncontrolled dive, the aircraft began disintegrating as speed increased exponentially. Luggage bins spilled open, oxygen masks dropped uselessly, and the interior of the cabin was destroyed. One final mayday call came from the pilots before power and communications were lost completely. Aeroflot Flight 593 plummeted at speeds over 500 mph as it approached the dark Siberian taiga forest below. Only 37 seconds elapsed between the initial stall and the moment the aircraft hit the ground. The pulverizing impact exploded the fuel tanks and created a fireball that scattered debris for nearly a mile. All 87 passengers and crew were killed instantly. In the morning light, recovery teams began arriving to the remote crash site via helicopter. They were met by a horrific scene, with bodies and wreckage strewn across a large swath of forest. The aircraft was completely demolished into tiny pieces barely recognizable as parts of a plane. The largest intact sections were only a few feet long. No one could have survived the catastrophic impact. Investigators from Russia's Interstate Aviation Committee were hampered by the lack of flight data or voice recorders. Both had been destroyed by intense ground fire after the crash. However, recovery efforts eventually located the black boxes, though they contained little data. After painstaking analyses and interviews with air traffic controllers, they began to piece together the events. The investigation concluded that the aircraft had gone out of control after the autopilot was inadvertently disconnected. Letting the co-pilot's inexperienced son sit at the controls directly led to the loss of control. Investigators recommended changes in training programs and cockpit procedures to prevent such lapses in the future. The crash of Aeroflot Flight 593 shocked Russia and the world. How could a modern jetliner with an experienced crew simply spiral out of control for no obvious reason? The public would not learn the full story until months later, when investigators completed their report, which included the cockpit voice recording transcript. Only then did authorities reveal the co-pilot's grave mistake in allowing his son at the controls, leading to the deaths of all aboard. The tragedy deeply impacted Russia's aviation industry and brought about overdue reforms. In the Western world, the crash also highlighted problematic cultural attitudes in Russian society, including an acceptance of rule breaking and a lack of accountability. The pilots had clearly acted irresponsibly, but were themselves victims of systemic problems that cultivated such behavior. For the families of the victims, the heartbreak was immense. Their loved ones had simply boarded a routine domestic flight, only to have their lives horrifically cut short for senseless reasons. The crash of Flight 593 remains one of Russia's deadliest disasters and taught harsh lessons about appropriate conduct in aviation. By shining a light on the human mistakes and cultural issues, officials hope to prevent similar accidents and ensure stability in Russia's vital airline industry. The final investigative committee report summed it up simply, stating the crash was due to unprofessional actions of the entire crew, loss of control of the plane as a result of a gross violation of operating procedures, and numerous violations of flight operations regulations. Though the pilots were deceased, their behavior was condemned in the strongest terms. The illegal inclusion of the co-pilot's son in the cockpit was an inconceivable wrongdoing. Ultimately, the awful tragedy of Flight 593 underscored the need for safety to be the absolute top priority in aviation. Even a momentary lapse of judgment can produce horrific outcomes, as innocents pay the price. The crash was a wake-up call regarding improprieties that had become normalized but were actually threats to Russia's flying public. Thanks to changes implemented after the disaster, flying is now safer and cultural attitudes continue to evolve. Though nothing can undo the sorrow caused by Aeroflot Flight 593, its legacy leaves Russian aviation stronger and more accountable today.